We've seen a series of unverified videos showing Wagner troops have moved past Rostov. They're in the center of the southern city, and they're moving up towards Voronezh, which is about 500 kilometers north and about halfway between Rostov and Moscow. I think at this point, it's very apparent that Wagner has established a very serious presence in Rostov, which is the headquarters of Russia's armed forces fighting in Ukraine. And Valery Gerasimov, who is the overall commander of Russia's armed forces, has effectively been forced to flee and hightail it to Moscow ahead of Prigozhin's men coming into the city. It's a very fluid situation, and things are changing very, very quickly.
We're also hearing from the Ministry of Defence that Russian troops have likely remained passive as the Wagner Group progresses north. How significant is that, Gabriel, in terms of how this could escalate and how quickly it could escalate?
Well, I think it's worth understanding that there are actually very few Russian troops in the interior of the country. It's not like there's huge volumes of hardware and manpower sitting around in military bases waiting to roll these guys back. Actually, Russia has heavily overextended itself in Ukraine. It's committed a huge amount of manpower already. And it's very unclear whether they can even get the people into the positions that they want them to be in order to maintain a defensive perimeter around these cities. And at the same time, Russia's armed forces are clearly demoralized. This has been a long and grueling war, and they've made very few gains. And obviously, many Russians have had real reservations around killing Ukrainians, who they see as a brother nation in some cases. And actually, what they've now faced with the situation where one contingent of Russian troops are fighting another contingent of Russian troops potentially. Yeah. So I think the desire to fight and die for, this effective massive political mess is actually very limited. According to Prigozhin, the border troops that are manning the frontier around Rostov had actually greeted his men with open arms. And it seems like there's been very, very little resistance. They've effectively captured a Russian city with almost no opposition.
Extraordinary. A message here from Ali, Gabriel, that I think is really worth us picking up on. Ali's text, 87222, times at the beginning of the message. Where does this leave Belarus and Lukashenko?
Well, it's obviously a fascinating question. Belarus has kind of committed itself to supporting the war politically, but not militarily. A NATO planner recently told me that the biggest secret of Eastern European warfare is just how bad Belarus's army is. It's effectively non-existent. And at the same time, Lukashenko is deeply dependent on Putin for political support. I think at this point, it's very, very unclear even what the ramifications are for Russia, let alone for someone like Lukashenko, who depends on Russia to maintain a hold on the country. But clearly, if there's an effective existential fight for the future of the Russian armed forces, for the future of the Putin regime, which is not impossible, it might be the case that Lukashenko actually is the only guy who's in charge of a few contingents of troops who could go and put down a rebellion. Whether they'd be able to, whether they would, is very unclear.
All right. We heard from Putin a little earlier, of course. He described this as a betrayal, as treason, following that dramatic challenge. He didn't actually mention Prigozhin by name as well, by the way, which was quite notable, I think. What did you make of Putin's response, Gabriel, and how important is that going to be for him, what is increasingly a desperate situation?
I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it? It's absolutely unimaginable. If you'd have thought in February last year that this is where we would end up, it's absolutely unthinkable. But it's clear that Putin has an entirely new challenge on his hands. He doesn't know what to make of it. The Wagner Group have been an effective fighting force inside Ukraine. So he's basically given them the free rein to exercise violence and basically operate completely unrestricted. And now, unfortunately for him, he's created a beast that he can no longer control, evidently. And I think it remains, you have to almost question, what is the point of the Russian state, this hugely militarized, autocratic police state? What is the point of it if, a guy with a few thousand mercenaries can effectively capture the south of the country? I mean, it's absolutely astonishing.
And obviously, we've seen Putin today give that address from Moscow. The Russian people, Gabriel, will have seen Vladimir Putin give that address from Moscow as well. What does this do to his authority in a country that he has had a relatively tight grip on?
Yeah, it's hard to know because I think one of the moves that Prigozhin has been careful to play out is not to directly criticize the commander-in-chief. He basically says the king is being misled. Right. He's been misled by the military, misled by his generals, and basically, I'm the true Putin loyalist, is what he's saying. And actually, he wants to oust the armed forces chiefs so that he can fight a better war in Ukraine, is effectively his pitch. So it's really unclear as to how much personal damage Putin takes from this. But certainly, I mean, if we go towards a situation where the war was once very far away for most Russians in Ukraine, now then it was inside their borders, and now it's inside the city where you live. I mean, it does create obviously a huge urgency for them to get a grip on what's going on, and so far they appear to be unable to.
Just finally, Gabriel, let's end where we began and where we are now. Those Wagner troops moving north, heading, we believe, for Moscow. If and when they get there, what scenarios are we likely to see play out?
Again, it's almost impossible to know whether. I mean, at this point, I think Prigozhin is desperately trying to deliver a political machination. He has demands. He's threatening to take Moscow. He's threatening to march on the capital, but he hasn't actually done it yet. And it's very unclear whether he has the manpower to hold the territory that he's taken, as well as gain more. So I think what the most likely scenario is that he's probably pushing for a political deal, increased autonomy, the removal of the armed forces chiefs that he says have presided over this military catastrophe in Ukraine. And I think that the more dire that situation gets, the more attractive that deal looks to the policymakers in the Kremlin. But certainly if we saw Wagner troops flowing through the streets of Moscow, this would be a situation of the kind that I think we've not seen since the early 20th century. I mean, that would really, truly be a genuine historic moment in the history of Russia and indeed the history of the world.